the Center for Biological Diversity. So as I mentioned, we are a sponsor for this conference, and one of the things we really focus on is making sure that our public and our members and our e-activists, hopefully we have one or two in the audience, really know about the issues. So this is an important component of what we do. So thank you all for coming today on such a beautiful day outside. I know it's not necessarily you want to spend all your time indoors, but I guarantee we'll make it fun, or at least I'll try to. So we'll just go ahead and kick it off. Oops. So what I'll talk about today for the next 30 minutes or so is kind of give us a whirlwind spin through some of the major sections of the Endangered Species Act, talk about a little bit of the importance of the Endangered Species Act and the successes, and use case illustrations of work that we've done with the Center for Biological Diversity to enforce the Endangered Species Act. So we'll talk about the success of the Endangered Species Act. It's been enacted. This is the 40th year of the ESA. So we'll talk a little bit about the importance of it and wax poetic briefly about it. We'll talk a little bit about the listing under Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act. We'll talk a little and talk about the importance of citizen petitions and you and me and scientists and other individuals that can actually force our government to do something to protect wildlife. We'll talk a little bit about the candidate species under the listing process. We'll talk about consultation under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which requires agencies or federal government agencies to talk to one another before they harm endangered species so that they choose alternatives that are some of the less harmful than their typical alternative. We'll talk about pesticides in relation to that. I spend a fair amount of my time analyzing issues of toxics and pesticide use. And then we'll talk a little bit about Section 9, which is the take prohibition, prohibiting anyone from harming, harassing, killing endangered species. We'll talk about that in the context of rodenticides. So the Center for Biological Diversity is very focused, as I mentioned, on protecting biodiversity and endangered species. We do that to protect wildlife and their habitat through a range of different mechanisms. I'm an attorney, so I do a fair amount of litigation, but we also do outreach like this, communication and education. We rely a lot on our staff scientists and the science and peer-reviewed publications to really emphasize the points. We do creative media, public relations, really trying to get issues out there, get them aware in the general public. And we also work with policy, trying to get legislation passed, trying to fight bad legislation, which oftentimes ends up being the case. We have over 620,000 members and e-activists who are a critical component of our grassroots movement to effect positive change on the environment and biodiversity. So we're going to take a minute to think about the Endangered Species Act as it's been enacted for 40 years now. I'm going to give you some quotes, and we're going to, this is the engagement. This is where you get to interact with me a little bit. So I want to give you a quote about the ESA that was put into place 40 years ago. "Nothing is more priceless and more worthy of preservation than the rich array of animal life with which our country has been blessed. It is a many-faceted treasure of value to scholars, scientists, and nature lovers alike, and it forms a vital part of the heritage we all share as Americans." Now, does anybody know who put forward this very thoughtful and profound quote? Anyone? Guess? What was that? The President Nixon, actually, who signed the Endangered Species Act. We don't typically think about Tricky Dick as being one of our foundational presidents in passing environmental laws, but he was. A lot of our foundational statutes, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, passed under Nixon due to the ground-well support from the legislature and citizens. But I thought that it's just so important to think about the importance of the act. And one of the reasons it's so important is it works. It's been incredibly successful. Over 99.6% of species on the list have not gone extinct. So if we get them on the list, species that are threatened with becoming extinct or threatened with becoming endangered are going to stay existing, which is very significant. We've got to think about this in the context of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the 6th largest mass extinction on our planet. And scientists estimate we are now losing species at 100 to 1,000 times the background rate, with literally dozens going extinct every day. So if we can do something to get species on the Endangered Species Act list, then we can make sure that they're going to stay around for future generations. Once they're on the list, that's stabilizing their population trend and making sure they're moving towards recovery. The ESA has been 93% successful. And once they're on the list, a recovery plan is required to be developed for these species, setting forward a roadmap or blueprint within which we can as a society and as a federal government agency with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service, implement actions to get them off the list, to get them recovered. And once they're on that list, the recovery timeline within which they're meeting those recovery goals is 82% successful. So, a very high rate of success given the overall circumstances. And it's important to remember that because we're dealing with, every couple of years, a very hostile Congress that tries to gut or reform the Endangered Species Act. So we want to make sure that we emphasize the importance of it. So Section 4 is the listing process, designating critical habitat that's essential for the survival of species, and also sets forward the path for recovery of endangered species. And this is where we can play a critical part. The Endangered Species Act allows the agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, to put forward its own petition to list species, to petition itself, essentially, to move forward with protecting the species. It also allows us, or organizations like the Center for Biological Diversity, to put forward a scientific petition to basically tell the agency, hey, this species is in peril, it's likely to go extinct, it's likely to become endangered, you need to protect it. And then it sets forth a very strict time frame within which the agency needs to act. So we'll talk a little bit about candidate lists, and in 2000 we actually petitioned to get the Pacific fisher listed under the Endangered Species Act. Hopefully that will be happening soon, and we'll talk a little bit about why it's taken so long to get there. So we can also petition for individual species or groups of species. The center put forward a petition to list 404 species in the southeast, mostly freshwater aquatic animals, because of the high contamination and high degradation of habitat of those species. And I talked a little bit about the petition process sets off a time frame or a clock within which the agency needs to act. And fortunately, it's a very strict time frame within which, and under the law, it is very clear what they need to do within a certain time frame. And if the agency isn't acting, because sometimes our government shuts down, sometimes it doesn't work. So it allows us as individuals to go to the courts, say, you, agency, are not acting within a time frame within which you need to do. We can get a court order telling the agency to make that decision on whether the species needs to get listed or not. And that's been incredibly important for the work that we do to make sure there's not sort of a loss of momentum within protecting wildlife. So what the agency does, once it's forced to make a decision, or when it makes a decision of its own volition, decides it's warranted for listing, decides it's not warranted for listing, it's not endangered, it's not threatened, or it decides it's warranted but precluded. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it can also decide under Section 4 that animals can be delisted. And some of our most successful Endangered Species Act recovery efforts are bald eagle, our national symbol, which is very valuable that we didn't push our national symbol over into the brink of extinction, been very successful in coming back. The American alligator has been very successful, has been delisted from the Endangered Species Act, as well as the brown pelican. And a lot of that has to do with us getting rid of pesticides that harm species like the eagle and the pelican, in particular DDT. So the warranted but precluded candidate list, that was that third option, option C, of what the agency can do. It allows the government to basically say, okay, there's a species that should be protected, but we don't have the resources right now to protect that one because there's other higher priority species that need to get listed. You're going to have to get in line in the emergency room, in the waiting room for the emergency room, behind a whole raft of other species because we need to make decisions on those. And that makes a certain logical sense. However, under the Bush administration and under the Clinton administration, that backlog got to be tremendous. So we looked to ways to address that. The backlog was so significant that the average time for species in the warranted but precluded or candidate category was 17 years. And when they're on that list for 17 years, they're not getting the protection of the Act. They're not getting with the tools that they need to maintain that 99% success rate and staying protected and staying around. And 24 species had gone extinct while waiting in the waiting room for the emergency room before they could get on the Endangered Species Act list. So in 2005, the Center for Biological Diversity filed a lawsuit against the Fish and Wildlife Service to basically get to those 283 species that were waiting on the candidate list progress. Because what had happened is it didn't really get to a point where the agency was making expeditious progress on the actual getting those species listed. They're not supposed to put them in some sort of purgatory. They're supposed to move forward in a methodical process. And it essentially just ended up being a purgatory for these species. They went there and they never got listed. Some of them went extinct. So we forced the agency to make that expeditious process and in 2011, 6 years after we filed suit and have the wheels of justice turn slowly, we obtained a very successful settlement of 757 species, those 283 that were on the essential candidate list, as well as the 404 species roughly that we talked earlier about in the Southeast petition. We got a legal time frame within which the Fish and Wildlife Service needed to make a decision on those 757 species. Now, it doesn't say whether they actually have to list them or not. It says they have to make a decision. So it was a process-driven outcome. But what we found is that many of the species that were on the warranted but precluded list were already candidates. They already recognized that they needed to be protected. So under as our settlement has moved forward throughout the years, over 100 species have been protected as a result of it, and over 60 have been proposed for protection. So we're recognizing that once the agency acts, it's generally doing the right thing. There may be some issues involving like sage grouse or other, other species like the wolf, where there's certain political decisions that are going into play. But overall, the agency is moving forward, what we think, in a pretty appropriate way. In addition to getting species protected, we've also had critical habitat designated. That's the area it's essential for the recovery, survival and recovery of the species. So millions of critical habitat has been designated. All species, all of us need a place to live. So the wildlife, the critical habitat is an important component of getting wildlife protected. So what I spend a lot of my time on is focusing on contamination and toxics, how that harms wildlife and also how that harms us. Trying to find different avenues to address the contamination that impacts wildlife from pesticides, endocrine disrupting chemicals or hormone disrupting chemicals, lead, mercury, coal, uranium mining, fracking, all these different things that contaminate the environment end up poisoning wildlife, particularly amphibians like the Tehachapi slender salamander there, because of the life history, are particularly sensitive to environmental contaminants. So pesticides, we also spend a lot of our time focusing on. Pesticides are pervasive in our environment. A study by the USGS found that over 90% of waters and fish tested within the U.S. have exposure to pesticides in their system. Similarly, studies about the blood within babies and when they're born demonstrates that even before we're born, we actually have pesticides and chemicals in our systems. So what we can do to address that benefits wildlife as well as human health. And we've approached it through the Endangered Species Act. We focus a lot on the ESA at the center and the consultation component of the Endangered Species Act. What does consultation do? It requires, as I mentioned earlier, agencies to talk to each other and consult with each other before they do something that potentially harms an endangered species. So any agency funding, authorizing, conducting activities, they're prohibited from jeopardizing the endangered species. Jeopardizing means send it to extinction. So that makes sense. If one agency of the government is trying to protect species, you don't want the other agency sending it towards extinction. So for example, if we had the Endangered Species Act when you were building the Iron Gate Dam, we would have dealt with the issue of salmon, which are being imperiled through some of the Klamath dams. It requires agencies to talk to one another. There needs to be that federal nexus. Now, this is just federal agencies talking to one another. It's not state agencies or local agencies. At the outcome will be a biological opinion determining whether that action will jeopardize the species, and if it will, what reasonable and prudent measures would prevent it from becoming in jeopardy of extinction. So we've approached it through the EPA's process of approving chemicals and pesticides for use within the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency, when it approves a pesticide to be used, methyl iodide, any type of product that may be used on the environment, it should be analyzing how that pesticide will harm wildlife. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that when the EPA approves products under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, or Rodenticide Act, it's not evaluating the impact. It's not consulting with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service about how those impacts are harming wildlife. So that's a mandatory process. EPA, since 1993, hasn't gone forward with a single consultation without a court order, without being forced to under litigation. And so we've been one of the entities trying to force EPA to do that. We focused a lot on amphibians, as we touched on earlier, because of their life history and their unique aquatic environment. When they're growing, they're particularly susceptible to chemicals. The California red-legged frog was harmed potentially by several pesticides. And we filed a lawsuit in 2002 to force the Environmental Protection Agency to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service to analyze the impacts of pesticides that are harming the California red-legged frog. EPA agreed, said we'll go through the consultation process. Unfortunately, 9 years later, EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service still had not completed that consultation process. So recently in 2011, we filed a lawsuit to force the completion of that consultation. So the agencies recognize they need to do it because of a range of different issues with questions about what's the appropriate science to be used, bureaucratic intransigence. It really requires citizen enforcement to get these things done. Similarly, in 2004, we filed a lawsuit to require the analysis of pesticides on the Barton Springs salamander in and around Austin, Texas. If any of you guys been there, Barton Springs is a very hallowed place for Austonians as well as wildlife species like the Barton Springs salamander. EPA is moving forward with the consultation process on that as well. So we recognize that those are good model suits to move forward. We applied that to a larger suite of species. In the Bay Area, there are a range of different endangered species because of the unique habitat requirements of a lot of these species. So we required the EPA to analyze the effects of 74 pesticides on 11 species, like the Alameda whipsnake, or that's the San Francisco garter snake, the Alameda whipsnake, San Joaquin kit fox, California red-legged frog again, a range of species in that area. And importantly, as part of the lawsuit and the settlement, we got interim restrictions. So because EPA wasn't moving forward with the consultation process, we got buffer zones around areas where there's wildlife habitat, improved labeling on certain products so that there's a better idea of where they should be used and where they're harming wildlife species. So we took that lawsuit and decided, hey, let's ramp this up a little bit more. Let's go nationwide. Let's go all in on this. And we are in the process of a lawsuit that is requiring the consultation of over 300 pesticides on 200 threatened and endangered species across the U.S. That has proven a complicated lawsuit, and we're in the process of continuing to litigate that case, but are hopeful we will get to a positive outcome in the end. EPA recognizes it needs to go through with this process. Again, it's just a problem where even after you have the National Academy of Sciences this year, putting out a report that they need to improve their process, the agencies are still not figuring it out. So we'll still be there to try and push them to do that. Another thing I'm going to talk a little bit about today, which is something I've been focusing a lot on this year as well, is rodenticides and the harm of rodenticides on wildlife species. And if you have the chance to go to the next speaker, Dr. Murad Gabriel will be talking, I'm sure, a little bit about rodenticides and the harm to Pacific fishers, so I encourage you to go hear more about his great research that he's done to demonstrate the harm on species. But what's on a particular sensitive species here in Northern California and Northwest. But I want to talk broadly about how it's affecting the entire food web. What are rodenticides? Rat or mouse poisons, decon, tomcat, other types of rat poisons you get off the shelf or you buy in your farm and feed store, put out there to kill rats. Unfortunately, it doesn't just kill rats and mice, it kills the entire species in the entire food web as it bioaccumulates. So the rats or mice eat the rodenticide. They're then eaten by different types of mammals or birds and raptors, and they suffer from the harm of rodenticides as they bioaccumulate in the food web. And I'm going to talk specifically about super toxic rodenticides or second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, a series of particularly harmful rat and mouse poisons that are having significant effects on wildlife. And the significant effects they're having is they've been found in 73% of wildlife tested in California has been exposed to these super toxic rodenticides. And why are they super toxic? There's a range of different other types of rodenticides. There's neurotoxins, there's first generation anticoagulants, and first generation are what came out the first time just after World War II. But the chemical industry wanted to go nuclear, wanted to go with second generation, and wanted to go with super toxic products. And those are those four up there: rotificum, bromadiolone, diphenthioalone, and difenicum, which are particularly potent, particularly harmful, because rats and mice can go back and feed on them several times throughout a week. They're slow-acting poison. So they go back and feed a couple times, and they get this essentially super toxic, or 2 or 3 times the actual dose that's needed to kill them. And when they are then eaten by other types of predators, that predator immediately receives what could be a lethal dose. So it's a particularly insidious type, and these are actually much more problematic in terms of what we're seeing in actual harm to a large degree than the first generation, even though we encourage people not to use any type of rodenticide use. And the impacts, not only are they found in a lot of species tested, they're found in a lot of different species. Over 25 species in California alone have been found with these super toxic rodenticides. Eagles, great horned owls, kit foxes, bobcats, fishers, badgers, raccoons, just anything that basically will eat rodents or that could potentially eat the bait itself. And this is a rather gruesome mechanism of death for wildlife species. Foxes are something that's been particularly harmful. This is the top center is a gray fox that was brought into a facility called Wildlife Rehabilitation Facility in Marin. Unfortunately, that fox did not survive. They weren't able to get the amount of vitamin K into the system that it needed to survive. Essentially what it does is it leads the animal to bleed to death through internal hemorrhaging or through external, it receives a cut. The anticoagulant component of the anticoagulant rodenticide basically prevents the blood from clotting, essentially bleeds to death, and that can happen through some internal injury, or it can just happen to a point where it gets to a certain level in the system that the animal bleeds to death. So you can see a kestrel on the bottom left and a grouse on the bottom right. These both suffered from anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. Sure. I will try to project a little bit more, absolutely. So we've joined a coalition and worked to create a coalition of many groups throughout the state who are concerned not only with wildlife health, but also with public health, because the rodenticide poisonings are occurring not just in wildlife, they are occurring within humans as well. About the Environmental Protection Agency, when it moved forward to restrict some of the rodenticide products that are used, found that about 15,000 children have been poisoned with these rodenticides. So it moved forward to restrict the type of use, but we think that these harms are too great for the products. There are better alternatives, and we've worked also to create what's called the Safe Rodent Control Coalition, putting forward a coalition of municipalities, of wildlife groups, of farmers groups, of public health entities that are concerned with the harm of rodenticides. And also, it's a saferodentcontrol.org provides opportunities for you to learn about better alternatives to rodenticide use. And just last week, we submitted a letter with 70 groups, and 11,000 Californians submitted individual comments to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, urging them to ban these super toxic rodenticides. So how does this play into the Endangered Species Act? It violates the take prohibition of the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act prohibits an individual, state agency, federal agency, anyone, anything, from harming, harassing, pursuing, hunting, shooting, wounding, killing, trapping, capturing, collecting, or attempting to do any of those to endangered species. And the harm and harass kind of gets a little bit more, gets a little bit broader definition in the law, where it prohibits habitat modification or something that's likely to disrupt normal behavioral patterns, breeding, feeding, or sheltering. So when you have these rodenticides that are actually ending up killing species like the San Joaquin kit fox, the Pacific fisher, which will hopefully be listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act soon, or the northern spotted owl, you are violating the take prohibition of the Endangered Species Act. And the agency that approved those products in California, California Department of Pesticide Regulation, is violating the law. The agency should not be approving products that lead to violations of other laws. And we have some pretty clear case law that demonstrates that when you are actually using state-approved activities like fishing, and that entangles whales, that is an activity that's prohibited under the Endangered Species Act. Same theory applies here, where you have a product that is killing endangered species. So we sent a notice of intent to sue the California Department of Pesticide Regulation for the approval and the registration of these pesticide products. And they are now moving forward with some type of activity to restrict those products, which is a valuable step forward. They are making them restricted use materials. What does that mean? That means that you'll no longer be able to go buy the decon on the shelves that has those second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which is very favorable. Consumer use is a large part of the problem. However, they're still allowing those products to be used by licensed applicators. And if you've ever walked around downtown and seen all of the plastic, black or gray bait boxes that have the rat poison in them, you realize that those aren't probably put out by individuals. They're put out by licensed applicators. So there still will be a lot of this second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide super toxic products out in the system, still potentially threatening wildlife. Department of Pesticide Regulation has also expanded what it requires for what's going to be allowed for private applicators, individuals who have farmers who have poultry farms or egg farms or livestock operations will be able to use these products a little more frequently. And for species like the San Joaquin kit fox, which lives in the San Joaquin Valley, which also has the highest poultry and egg operations in the state of California, greater use by those individuals will cause problems. And the kit fox is a particularly troubling example because there are studies that have been reported in the Bakersfield area that find that 87% of kit foxes tested have these second-generation anticoagulants in them. So and we have documented necropsy reports of wildlife that have been killed. So it's a significant problem, and we hope through a range of legal and policy and advocacy mechanisms that we can help address that, and through good research that's being done by scientists out there finding where it can come into play and other factors besides just consumer use. So I'm going to allow us a couple minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? 87, yeah.
Do those anticoagulants remain, accumulate, or do they eventually pass through, or do they just stay there?
Yeah, good question, and thanks for clarifying that. So these products have half-lives of a certain amount of time. The second-generation anticoagulants have a much longer half-life of getting out of the system. Essentially, the way that they find that these products are in animals are typically through necropsies of the liver. Once they die, they're able to take out a section of the liver, and they can see if the liver's filtered it out or not. And the second-generation anticoagulants take a lot longer to get out of the system. They do eventually get out, but it takes a long time, up to like 250 days. So they can be cumulative. They can get doses from one rat, from another rat, and it can bioaccumulate over a long time just within that animal. So it can be a real problem. And a lot of these wildlife species that we're finding with super toxic rodenticides, they're not just one rodenticide. They have oftentimes several different kinds of rodenticides, but usually there's one that will be the most. And what we're finding the most is burdificum, which is pretty problematic in a lot of wildlife species.
Have you ever found any evidence that they actually do research to intensify these deaths of these supplemental animals that they consider?
Whether the agency is considering the supplemental sort of effects of these products as they get up in the food chain, is that what you're asking?
Well, the industry.
So the industry, yeah, the industry, it's often the fox watching the hen house sort of thing. They're putting forward their tests to the EPA when they are trying to get these products approved, and they are typically only analyzing a single dose effect on an individual organism. So they're not looking at what the real world effects are in the environment.
Found any evidence of them trying to manipulate the, like obviously they don't like kit foxes, right? They don't like birds either because they serve agriculture, right?
Yeah, I think.
Don't they do that? Isn't there evidence they do that intentionally, looking for ways to kill these animals?
Yeah, I don't think that they're intentionally focused to really impact the rats and the mice. I wouldn't say that the entity is that Decon is trying to intentionally kill kit foxes because that opens them up to a whole world of liability and bad PR. So they don't want to kill their pets. One of the things that comes up a lot is not only wildlife getting killed, but pets and cats and dogs eating these things. So they typically want to just harm the individual thing they're targeting, and the secondary impacts, they're not necessarily. It's more of a damage control thing for them than an issue where they're actually intentionally doing it, I think.
Ever been any evidence of that?
I can never say never, but my general indication is that they're really focusing more on the individual pests themselves. Yes?
You made earlier about President Nixon and the environmental laws that came into effect then. And so now we do not have an environmental person
Well, the revolving door between the business community or the lobbyists and the agencies is a real problem across the board. You know, we have Dick Cheney coming in and becoming vice president and giving the first contract under the wars to Halliburton for, you know, action being done there. So this is a real issue. It isn't as much of a concern under the Obama administration as it was under the Bush administration when it was so brazen. However, there still is that problem where industry lobbyists often have an open door into public agencies, and when it's particularly problematic, we do try to spotlight that, and we see it tainting decisions. But we did have a campaign focusing on that more under the Bush administration than the Obama administration, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem now. So, yeah, please.
I was just curious, what is CBD doing in regards to, since second generations are being pulled off, the chemical manufacturers now are revamping to put in bromethylene,
Yeah.
which there's absolutely no antidote for.
Yeah.
And now that's going to replace, but there's, again, like you mentioned, just a lack of data of secondary poisoning for that. And I'm just worried about, it's the constant chase. I'm wondering about, like, are you guys trying to possibly address the next generation of rodenticides out there?
The bromethylene issue, you know, I think is one that is certainly a good point. Bromethylene is one of the non-anticoagulants. It's a neurotoxin, I think, and so that ends up targeting the animal. And I think that it isn't as problematic in secondary poisonings, right? It's more, ends up killing the organism as much. So from a wildlife perspective, we don't see as harmful, although from an individual perspective of kids and pets potentially consuming those, that's more problematic. So what EPA has done to create tamper-resistant requirements, I think will, for packaging, because bromethylene is still on the consumer market for consumers to put in homes, that certainly, I think, takes a big step, and I think it's a big step in protecting non-target organisms, including kids and pets, which I think are the biggest problem there. And so I think we're trying to really focus on what's having the most harm right now. I think that there is a bit of a concern of it being somewhat of an argument where, well, the industry is saying, well, there's something that's worse out there that we're going to have to use, so use those second generations. You got to leave them on the market. We don't necessarily buy into that. I think there are ways to limit that product as well, or make it less available or used in certain narrow ways that it can be safer for wildlife, pets, and kids. Well, thank you, everybody. I think that's pretty much my time. I had to kind of breeze through things quickly. So please make sure to catch the next speaker, and I really appreciate everyone coming today. Thank you.
Can you hang around for a few and answer more questions outside?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. For those that want to hang around and maybe ask Jonathan a few more questions, to make themselves available out here somewhere or even here in this room. Murad Gabriel from the Integral Ecology Research Center. His talk will start in about 10, 12 minutes down in the JVD, and he'll be discussing the effects of rodent